A severed head can remain conscious for up to 30 seconds after decapitation. A grotesque final half-minute where the eyes might blink, the lips attempt to speak, and awareness lingers as life fades away. For Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, and perhaps history's most famous beheaded queen, this horrifying possibility was just one aspect of her execution that contemporary accounts often sanitize. The true story of Anne's final moments reveals a psychological torture far more disturbing than a simple swing of the sword, a calculated political spectacle designed to destroy not just her body, but her very legacy. Anne's execution stands as a testament to Tudor England's brutal justice system, where death was merely the culmination of a carefully orchestrated humiliation. While many history books simply note that she was beheaded for treason, the reality of her final days involves a psychological dismantling so methodical it would impress even modern torturers. Her execution wasn't just an ending, it was the final act in Henry VIII's campaign to erase a woman who had grown too powerful for his comfort. By May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn had already endured 17 days of imprisonment in the Tower of London, the same fortress where she had once prepared for her coronation. Just 3 years earlier, she had been crowned Queen of England in an elaborate ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now, she awaited death in a strange limbo, repeatedly delayed as Henry VIII cruelly extended her psychological torture. The king had even summoned an expert swordsman from Calais to perform the execution rather than using the traditional English axe, a detail often presented as mercy, but which simply emphasized the theatrical nature of what was to come. During her final hours, Anne exhibited an almost unnatural calm, described by witnesses as cheerful, even as she prepared for death. Modern psychologists might recognize this as dissociation, a psychological defense mechanism triggered by extreme trauma. She reportedly joked that she would be known as Anne sans tête, Anne without a head, displaying gallows humor that masked her inner turmoil. Few historical accounts acknowledge the sheer terror she must have felt, knowing that her reputation was being systematically destroyed through false accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy to murder the king. What makes Anne's execution particularly disturbing isn't just the physical act of beheading, but the calculated dismantling of her identity. Henry VIII didn't just want Anne dead, he wanted her erased from history, her contributions nullified, and her daughter Elizabeth delegitimized. The execution was the culmination of a character assassination campaign designed to justify to the English people why their once beloved queen deserved such a fate. In the days before her death, Anne was forced to hear lurid, fabricated tales of her alleged sexual depravity, accusations so outlandish they would be dismissed by any modern court. The morning of May 19th dawned unusually bright for London, a stark contrast to the dark events about to unfold. Anne had spent her final night in prayer, though sleep repeatedly eluded her. Tower records indicate she requested the sacrament at 2 in the morning, kneeling before the host for hours in desperate communion. By dawn, she had already been awake for nearly 24 hours, her mind undoubtedly fractured by stress and exhaustion. When the tower lieutenant came to fetch her, she was reportedly laughing with her ladies, a reaction that speaks not to peace, but to psychological breakdown. Anne's execution had been scheduled and rescheduled multiple times, an often overlooked form of psychological torture. The uncertainty of not knowing exactly when death would come was a deliberate tactic used against prisoners. When finally informed that the hour had arrived, Anne was led from her chambers through corridors where, just 3 years earlier, she had processed as queen-to-be. Now guards flanked her not out of respect but to prevent escape, and the same courtiers who had once bowed before her now watched her final walk with calculated indifference. The scaffold erected on Tower Green was unusually low, standing just 3 feet off the ground, contrary to the towering platforms often depicted in films. This deliberate design choice forced Anne to mount only a few steps, robbing her of the dignity of elevation and keeping her closer to the jeering crowd. While modern depictions often show a solemn, respectful gathering, historical records suggest a carnival-like atmosphere had been encouraged. The execution was public theatre after all, a warning to any who might challenge the king's authority, particularly women who dared reach above their station. Before kneeling at the block, Anne was permitted a final speech, not out of mercy, but because tradition demanded it. Her words, carefully measured, revealed both her political acumen and her desperate circumstances. "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, for according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it." This apparent submission to her fate was in fact her final act of rebellion. By acknowledging the law while not admitting guilt, she subtly challenged the legitimacy of the charges against her. Most disturbing, perhaps, was the king's absence. Unlike the public representation of royal executions, Henry VIII did not attend, instead waiting at Whitehall Palace for confirmation of Anne's death. Even as the sword severed her head from her body, Henry was reportedly celebrating his upcoming marriage to Jane Seymour, a brutal testament to how completely discarded Anne had become. The personal had become political, and Anne's death was merely an inconvenient necessity in the king's pursuit of a male heir. The swordsman from Calais, specifically requested and paid a substantial sum for his expertise, represented another level of calculated cruelty. Traditional English beheadings used an axe, which often required multiple blows to sever the head completely. The French swordsman, while more likely to achieve decapitation in a single stroke, was unfamiliar to Anne. In her final moments, she would face death at the hands of a stranger, a final indignity for a queen who had once commanded the attention of all England. Her blindfolding, often depicted as mercy to spare her the sight of the sword, actually served a more practical purpose, preventing her from flinching at the crucial moment which could result in a botched execution. Anne knelt upright rather than placing her head on a block, another French tradition that heightened the executioner's challenge. This position forced Anne to remain still through sheer will, maintaining composure even as the swordsman prepared his strike. Witnesses reported that she continuously moved her lips in prayer, her eyes darting beneath the blindfold as she strained to detect any sound of the approaching blade. The psychological torment of this moment, knowing death approaches but not when, represents a form of torture rarely acknowledged in sanitized historical accounts. The actual beheading was impressively clean by Tudor standards. A single stroke severed Anne's head, but what happened immediately after is often omitted from polite historical narratives. According to witness accounts, her eyes and lips continued to move for several seconds after decapitation, a horrifying physiological response that occurs when oxygen remains in the brain tissue. Some accounts even suggest her lips formed words, perhaps continuing the prayer interrupted by the sword's blow. The sight was so disturbing that several witnesses fainted, while others turned away in horror at this grim reminder of the tenuous connection between body and soul. Perhaps, most tellingly, no proper coffin had been prepared for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, overcome with grief and horror, had to scramble to find an arrow chest in which to place her head and body. This seemingly minor oversight speaks volumes about the complete disregard for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was an afterthought, a political problem solved rather than a human being deserving of basic funerary respect. She was hastily buried in an unmarked grave within the Tower Chapel without proper Christian ceremony, as though the king hoped her memory would fade as quickly as her life had ended. Henry's determination to erase Anne extended beyond her death. Court painters were instructed to destroy her portraits. Her royal emblems were chiseled from palace walls, and courtiers quickly learned that mentioning her name could lead to royal disfavor. While we often focus on the physical act of execution, this systematic elimination of Anne's very existence represents a form of violence that transcended her death, an attempt to execute not just a person, but a legacy. It would be centuries before historians began the painstaking work of reconstructing Anne's life from the fragments that survived Henry's purge. Anne's execution also traumatized those forced to witness it, particularly her ladies-in-waiting, who had to clean and prepare her severed head before burial. These women, themselves terrified of being implicated in the Queen's alleged crimes, had to perform this grisly task while maintaining composure. Several reportedly suffered nightmares for years afterward, and at least one eventually entered a convent, unable to continue court life after what she had witnessed. The ripple effects of psychological trauma extended far beyond Anne herself, creating a climate of fear that permeated Henry's court for the remainder of his reign. In the immediate aftermath of the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, not yet 3 years old, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession. The child who would one day become England's greatest queen was effectively orphaned, her mother executed, and her father publicly denouncing her legitimacy. Court records show Elizabeth was suddenly without proper clothing or attendance appropriate to her former status. Her household dissolved almost overnight. This cruel treatment of a toddler represents yet another dimension of the horror surrounding Anne's execution. The punishment extended even to her innocent child. Most modern depictions of Tudor executions fail to capture the overwhelming sensory experience. The scaffold would have reeked of the blood from previous executions, buzzing with flies in the May warmth. The crowd's roar, manipulated by planted supporters instructed to cheer the Queen's death, created a wall of sound designed to disorient and terrify. Anne would have heard this cacophony growing louder as she approached Tower Green. The jeers and catcalls from a population encouraged to view her as a witch and adulteress. This carefully orchestrated public humiliation formed an essential part of Tudor justice. Death alone was never punishment enough. Popular culture often romanticizes Anne's final speech as a moment of dignified defiance, but historical records suggest a more nuanced reality. Her carefully worded address, praising the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, reflects the impossible position she occupied. Even facing certain death, Anne could not speak freely. Her words were constrained by concern for her daughter's future and the watching crowd's reaction. Her speech represents not freedom of expression but its opposite, the ultimate censorship of a woman who knew that even her final words would be reported to the king and could impact those she left behind. The sword that ended Anne's life, specially imported from France, symbolizes the performative aspect of her execution. Henry spared no expense to ensure a spectacle worthy of a queen's downfall. The executioner himself reportedly practiced on animals beforehand, determined to achieve the clean single stroke that would earn him his substantial fee. This cold professionalism, the reduction of Anne's death to a technical challenge, exemplifies the dehumanization inherent in state-sanctioned execution. Anne wasn't just killed. She was processed through a system designed to transform human suffering into political messaging. Contemporary accounts record that no English executioner would perform the task, not from any moral objection, but because the French sword technique required specialized training. The blade itself was razor-sharp and weighted differently than an English axe, designed for a swift horizontal strike rather than the downward chop of an axe. This technical detail underscores the theatrical nature of Anne's execution. Even the method of death was carefully selected for maximum impact and minimum messiness, ensuring the spectacle would proceed without the unseemly complications of a botched beheading. After the sword fell, witness Thomas Wyatt, himself imprisoned in the Tower and forced to watch the execution of a woman he had once admired, wrote of the little throat that had so many jewels hung about it. His poetic lament captures the grotesque transformation of Anne from adorned queen to objectified corpse. The severed head was immediately wrapped in linen by her weeping ladies, but not before the executioner held it aloft by the hair, a traditional gesture meant to demonstrate the completed sentence to the crowd. This moment of display, with blood still pumping from the severed arteries, served as the climactic visual that would imprint itself on witnesses' memories. Tower records indicate that Anne's remains were buried so hastily that proper Christian burial rites were abbreviated almost to non-existence. The arrow chest containing her head and body was placed beneath the chapel floor, among other executed nobles, an ignominious end for a crowned queen of England. No marker was placed to indicate her grave location, and for centuries her exact burial spot remained unknown. This erasure of even her final resting place represents the culmination of Henry's campaign to remove Anne not just from life, but from history itself, a campaign that nearly succeeded. In the days following the execution, Henry's propagandists worked diligently to shape public narrative. Court poets, who had once praised Anne's wit and beauty, now penned verses condemning her as a scheming adulteress. Official accounts emphasized the king's mercy in providing a skilled swordsman rather than the traditional axe, recasting Henry's theatrical choice as compassionate consideration. The execution's horror was systematically sanitized in official records, beginning the centuries-long process of historical revision that continues to influence our understanding of Anne's final moments. Perhaps most disturbing to modern sensibilities is how quickly life returned to normal for Henry VIII. The very day after Anne's execution, he became formally engaged to Jane Seymour. Within 2 weeks of sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry married his third in a quiet ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This callous speed reveals the execution as merely a convenient solution to a political problem. Anne had failed to provide a male heir, so she was eliminated and replaced. The personal tragedy of her death was completely subordinated to statecraft and dynasty building. The psychological dimension of Anne's execution extended beyond the scaffold. For weeks before her death, she had been subjected to relentless questioning, denied proper sleep, and isolated from supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister who engineered the charges against her, employed techniques remarkably similar to modern psychological torture: disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the strategic use of false information. By the time Anne reached the scaffold, she had already endured a campaign of mental breakdown designed to ensure she would present no problematic final resistance. Court records reveal the extraordinary security measures implemented for Anne's execution, far beyond what was standard for even high-ranking traitors. The Tower garrison was doubled, and special guards were positioned throughout the fortress complex. These precautions weren't designed to prevent escape. Rather, they ensured that no supporter could attempt a last-minute intervention or rally public sentiment against the execution. The overwhelming show of force served another purpose too: intimidating any who might sympathize with Anne into silent compliance with the king's will. The timing of the execution, scheduled for mid-morning rather than the traditional dawn, allowed for maximum attendance by London citizens. Tower Green could accommodate only a limited audience of nobility and officials, but the Tower's elevated profile meant that crowds gathered outside could hear the announcement of completion. Church bells throughout London would then signal the moment of death, creating a city-wide acknowledgement of royal power. This orchestration transformed Anne's private suffering into public performance, death as political theatre rather than personal tragedy. Among the most overlooked aspects of Anne's execution is the fate of her co-accused. 5 men, including her own brother George Boleyn, were executed just days before Anne on charges of adultery with the Queen. Their deaths served to establish the facts of Anne's alleged crimes before her own execution, preventing any possibility that their final speeches might contradict the official narrative. This coordinated judicial murder of 6 people, all convicted on essentially identical, fabricated evidence, represents one of Tudor England's most brazen acts of state violence, a purge comparable to Stalin's show trials centuries later. While Tower Green today features a memorial marking the approximate site of Anne's execution, contemporary records indicate the actual scaffold stood elsewhere in the Tower complex. This geographical confusion is emblematic of how Anne's death has been repeatedly reframed and relocated, both physically and historically, to serve different narratives. The sanitized, romantic version of her execution, found in popular culture, bears little resemblance to the psychological warfare, character assassination, and calculated cruelty that characterized her final days in May 1536. The horror of Anne Boleyn's execution lies not just in the physical act of beheading, but in understanding it as the culmination of a comprehensive campaign to destroy a woman who had risen too high for Tudor society's comfort. She was not merely executed, she was systematically unmade, her reputation destroyed, her achievements nullified, her very existence nearly erased from history. When we examine the full context of her final days, The psychological torture, the public humiliation, the calculated theatricality, and the attempted erasure of her memory, we confront a horror far more disturbing than the swift stroke of a Calais sword. From a modern psychological perspective, Anne's execution represents a case study in state-sanctioned gaslighting and public character assassination. The charges against her, ranging from adultery with multiple men, including her own brother, to conspiring to poison the king, were so outlandish they would never stand in any modern court. Yet through careful manipulation of public opinion, strategic use of torture to extract confessions from co-accused men, and control of all official narratives, Henry's government successfully convinced many that Anne deserved her fate. This systematic manipulation of reality itself constitutes perhaps the most horrifying aspect of her execution. 5 centuries later, Anne Boleyn's execution continues to fascinate precisely because it represents the intersection of personal tragedy and political calculation. Her death wasn't simply the end of a life, but a carefully orchestrated performance designed to justify a king's actions and reshape historical memory. The true horror lies not in the moment the sword fell, but in recognizing how completely power can rewrite reality, a lesson that resonates uncomfortably in our own era of information manipulation and character assassination. Anne's final tragedy may be that despite Henry's best efforts to erase her, her death, rather than her life, became her most enduring legacy. In understanding the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, gender, and the construction of historical narrative. The sanitized version of her death, an unfortunate queen meeting a quick, dignified end, serves to obscure the systematic abuse of state power that her case represents. By examining the psychological dimension of her execution, the calculated torments, the public humiliation, the destruction of reputation, and the attempted erasure of memory, we gain insight not just into Tudor justice, but into how authority maintains itself through control of both bodies and narratives. In Anne's severed head, we find a warning about the fragility of truth itself when confronted with absolute power.